And this hearing of the Select Committee on Energy Planning and Regulation in Australia. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. These proceedings, being video streamed live via Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as contempt. Witnesses before parliamentary committees cannot be sued or prosecuted for giving evidence or for the content of the evidence they give. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a Senate committee. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer or not, having regard to the ground on which the claim is made. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I now welcome representatives from Energy Networks Australia and the Australian Energy Council. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and protection of witnesses has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
I'm Dominic van den Berg, Chief Executive of Energy Networks Australia, and I'm joined here by Dominic Adams, General Manager for Networks.
Thank you. Gentlemen, online.
I'm David Feeney. I'm the General Manager of Wholesale and Environment for the Australian Energy Council.
And I'm Ben Barnes. I'm the General Manager of Corporate Affairs at the Australian Energy Council.
Mr Barnes, you're very faint, coming through very faint. I don't know whether you can move a microphone closer or anything, but just letting you know you're quite faint. Would anyone like to make an opening statement? Ms van den Berg.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present to the inquiry today. Energy Networks Australia is the national industry body representing Australia's electricity transmission and distribution and gas distribution networks. Our members provide more than 16 million electricity and gas connections to almost every home and business across Australia. We made a submission to the inquiry, so I won't take long now, but I would like to take this opportunity to highlight a few key elements. Our members are focused on driving a sustainable energy future for all Australians. As shown in the AER's recent Network Performance Report, in 2023, after adjusting for inflation, electricity consumers on average paid the lowest cost for electricity network services since this reporting started. The report also found that gas network costs were the lowest since the series began in 2011, both in real and nominal terms. And at the same time, we're seeing near all-time highs of reliability performance. As highlighted in our submission, there are strengths of our current framework that make Australia an attractive place for long-term investment, and Australia needs to attract during the energy transition. The strong institutional and governance arrangements in the energy market also directly support the long-term interests of consumers in ensuring efficient levels of investment. The Integrated System Plan is an important point of reference for the industry in describing the lowest cost pathway to deliver against a set of government policy objectives and ensuring that the system is reliable and secure. And Australia's National Energy Framework has evolved over time and will need to continue to flexibly evolve to deliver outcomes for consumers through the energy transition. Together with large-scale generation and transmission, ENA's The Time Is Now report identifies opportunities within the distribution grid that can be unlocked to help achieve national climate targets and deliver benefits to customers, making better use of what we have. Examples of this include options for promoting faster and wider delivery of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, getting more generation connected to the distribution grid, and soaking up that with more distribution-connected batteries. Importantly, these benefits can be unlocked now by a targeted, pragmatic set of actions available to policymakers and regulators under our framework. In addition, ENA's Renewable Gas for a Future Made in Australia report also highlights key opportunities for policymakers to support a decarbonisation pathway for our nation's heavy industry, which will be key in achieving the nation's decarbonisation goals. Thank you again for the opportunity to present, and I welcome your questions.
Australian Energy Council, do you have an opening statement?
Yes, Chair, thank you very much. So the AEC is pleased to appear and give evidence to the Select Committee inquiry into energy planning and regulation. The AEC is the peak industry body for electricity and downstream natural gas businesses operating in the competitive wholesale and retail energy markets. AEC members generate and sell energy to over 10 million homes and businesses and are major investors in renewable energy generation. The AEC supports reaching net zero by 2050, as well as a 55% emissions reduction target by 2035, and is committed to delivering the energy transition for the benefit of consumers. In our submission, we highlighted the critical importance of maintaining a clear governance structure that separates the roles of the AEMC, the AER and AEMO. Previous reviews, such as the Vertican review, have underscored the need for this separation to promote effective governance and investor confidence. We note that there's been a shift from energy policy being driven largely by market bodies to a situation where governments at both state and Commonwealth level are taking a more hands-on approach. Governments have created new institutions to give effect to this hands-on approach. While we understand the policy rationale, we do note that this could complicate roles and responsibilities. We support a timely review into the national electricity market's future market design to ensure clarity and certainty for investors. If the review was to be conducted by an institution like the Productivity Commission, we think it's important to coordinate the review with existing market bodies and jurisdictions. Lastly, we noted that streamlined regulatory processes, including post-implementation reviews, are important to evaluate the impact of major reforms. Finally, we called for AEMO to incorporate a baseline scenario in its integrated system plan. This transparency is vital for managing the energy transition effectively and ensuring it benefits all consumers. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Canavan, would you like to go first?
Cheers. Well, I might start where you just finished there, Mr Feeney. I am interested in your idea of AEMO being required to model what you called a baseline. Just take me through what you would expect that to include then.
Thanks, Senator. So what I meant by that was, and I think there's been a lot of evidence given by AEMO and a range of the different market bodies, is currently the integrated system plan really models what it would take for the to find an optimal development path to support the emissions reductions at different levels of government. We think that it would be a more valuable document if it also included whether it's a different scenario or whether it's a range of sensitivities that take into account what we're learning as we progress with this energy transition. So things like supply chain constraints, things like social licence challenges for things like wind farms could alter the trajectory that the transition goes on. And we think there's value from a market participant's perspective in having that as a scenario that gets modelled, as well as scenarios that are consistent with hitting emissions targets.
I suppose the question, though, here is, currently, as I understand it, they do their modelling based on government policies, so that includes an 82% renewable energy target, net zero emissions, etc. I'm just trying to work out, are you suggesting the baseline should have none of that, that it should just be purely sort of market-driven, if you like? Or if not, what policies should it have and what should it have? I'm just struggling to understand that.
I think what would be useful would be to have a most likely case of how that trajectory looks, and to the extent there's a delta between what would need to happen for that emissions reductions to come through and the trajectory that it looks like the energy system's on. I think that gives an opportunity for policymakers to help narrow that gap. So you'd still be aiming for the 82% reduction, but something that's more grounded in what's happening out there in the market, I think would help have a more informed debate about energy policy.
I suppose the political problem with that is, in effect, you're asking AEMO to rate the performance of their ministers in achieving their policy goals. So, for example, if AEMO said, "Oh, look, we don't think 82% renewables will be built by 2030; it'll just be 50%, 60%." Of course, the headline in every paper in the country will be, "Energy expert says government falling 50% short." So anyway, I don't think I'll ever be going back to the ministerial leather, but I can't believe any minister agreeing to such a process. Wouldn't it be more logical just to say, what if we just ran a baseline with no policies at all? No policy interventions, if you like, and then we can compare the two. That way they're not trying to mark, you're not asking AEMO to put in a very difficult position of marking the government's homework, so to speak.
Yeah, that would be an alternative approach, and I guess in the end it's a matter for policymakers, and the sense I have is that AEMO feels somewhat constrained by the national electricity rules in terms of how it can do the ISP, so it's open to policymakers to change that.
I mean, you'd make that point in your submission. Your submission, I think, says that you don't think they are constrained by the rules from doing this. Is that right?
That's our interpretation of it. We think it would, that version of a baseline that's more grounded in what's going on feels just like the usual kind of sensitivity analysis that you would do and generate kind of what-if scenarios. If this doesn't happen, then what do you do next? It just seems like a pretty good risk mitigation strategy to us.
Ms Vandenberg or Mr Adams, do you have anything to add on this particular issue about the ISP and how it is conducted?
I think overall we'd agree that what's included in the ISP is a matter for policymakers as to what they feel would be a helpful input for them to make the calls that they need to make if they intend to use the ISP as an input into their policy decision making. Then it's a call for them to set that direction for AEMO as to what's included within it.
Okay. Just going back then to the Energy Council and another issue in your submission you raise, do you support a capacity mechanism? Yeah, just a capacity mechanism.
So, just to be clear, are you talking about the capacity incentives?
No, I'm
okay.
talking about the previous proposals. I don't know the exact status of them, but the proposals to establish some kind of market for capacity that I believe the ESB back in the day might have been recommending or working up, but seems to have fallen on the wayside now. So what's the Energy Council's position on that?
Look, I think to be clear, there's probably a range of views within our members. We do observe that as the penetration of variable renewable energy increases, an energy-only market in terms of signalling for investment to come forward can be challenged relative to a capacity market. On the other hand, an energy market is incredibly well designed to signal operational timeframe decisions and make sure the right mix of energy shows up when it's most needed. So another thing we did say in our submission is we understand there's a potential market settings review that the Productivity Commission may or may not conduct, and we're keen to see that process kick off because we think that would be a really instructive process. And as we understand it, the CIS induces some of the VRE to come on between now and 2030, but you do need those market settings to be known well ahead of time so that investment can flow more based on market settings and less based on government intervention.
I mean, your submission says there's meant to be, I think, a review of the national energy market, the future market design of the national energy market, and apparently that in March, ministers agreed that they would finalise this review, including the final design of any capacity mechanism, by no later than the end of 2025. But your submission also says that the terms of reference for that has not yet been released. Is that still the case? We haven't even got a terms of reference for it yet?
That's certainly my understanding. We're hearing that it's not too far away, but we're no clearer than any other participant.
How long is the review expected to take? Have they mapped that out?
I think what's happened is the terms of reference has taken time to come out, but at this point in time, the end date hasn't shifted. And so, one of the things that worries us is if you compress the time frame of the review, it'll be less instructive than it could otherwise be.
For sure. Moving on again, you also talk about some of the changed responsibilities of the different market bodies and how there's potentially, I don't know if you use the word confusion, but that's what I took away from your submission. There's a little bit of mudding here. I suppose I particularly wanted to drill down to this issue of AEMO services. It's something that just jumped out at me when I read your submission, that apparently AEMO services will have some role in running the tenders for the capacity investment scheme. Then, of course, AEMO itself also designs this ISP, which seems to have become quite definitive in terms of planning for the energy market. So, to me, it just raises the issue of, is there a potential conflict here between one element of AEMO actually making effectively investments or deciding on investments on particular technologies, and it will be judged on the performance of those investments one way or another, and then also then actually designing the system, which will probably have a significant impact on whether those investments work or not?
Yeah, look, I don't know whether I characterise it as a conflict. You could make an argument that doing the upfront planning and setting out, what sorts of technologies you need, more of and less of, gives you a good springboard into making the tender decisions. But it is fair to say that AEMO's, scope of responsibilities, broadens year on year, and it is a new set of activities. And my understanding is AEMO services was set up as part of the New South Wales roadmap initially to administer the LTESs for New South Wales, and that role was kind of morphed to running CIS tenders on behalf of the Commonwealth, largely because they developed that expertise in the New South Wales context. So I guess it's kind of an example of, in the energy system, there's been a history over the last few years of one intervention begetting a further intervention, and it feels a bit piecemeal at times, and that's why I'd circle back to the NEM 2030 review. I think has a lot of merit in having a fresh look at things.
Yeah, just bouncing from one crisis to the next, basically. I suppose I'm happy to give, before I move on to energy networks, is there anything you wanted to add on that issue? You don't have to, it wasn't from your submission. But turning to your submission, and I think in your opening comments, you said that the cost of electricity network services is the lowest since 2011. Is that in absolute terms or as a share of the bill?
Absolute terms. Say again. It's a share. You mentioned it's the lowest cost for electricity network services. Is that in the actual cents or dollars terms, or is it as a share of an electricity bill? No, that's adjusting for inflation cost.
Just what, sorry?
Adjusting for inflation, that's cost.
Just the total cost in maybe you could give me the numbers. Have you got the numbers in front of you? What's the cost today?
I don't have those numbers in front of you.
Okay, you have to take that on notice for what it was. Presumably this is the lowest since 2011, isn't it? I was a bit confused.
I think the numbers are coming from the AER's Network Performance Report, which looks at the cost of delivering services over time.
Okay.
And the observation from that is that the incentive framework that underpins and sets the revenues for networks and provides incentives for networks to outperform is a framework that is delivering and driving greater performance for lower cost over time, and that's the kind of observation or takeaway there.
Okay, well maybe if you could take on notice, because your submission says the report also found gas network costs were the lowest since 2011, but I just wasn't sure if that time frame was relevant for the electricity point as well, the sentence that preceded it. So maybe you could take on notice over what time period is that your point in your submission relevant, so it's the lowest cost over what time period, and also what the actual numbers were at its previous peak and a previous low, and its low now. All right, well I might leave it there for time, Chair. I've got more questions if there is time.
If there's time, I'll come back to you.
Thank you.
Senator Gosh.
Thank you very much. If I could ask firstly to Energy Networks Australia, one of the debates that has emerged in this committee in the last couple of hearings has been a debate on the balance to be struck between distribution opportunities and whether consumer energy resources can be realised instead of building large-scale transmission projects. Could you offer your view on that debate and whether you believe that to be the case, or whether these are alternatives, or whether, in essence, we just need to be investing in all of these different options?
Thanks for the question, Senator. We firmly believe that this is not an either-or situation, and that to achieve net zero, we need transmission. We did publish this report, which is, I think, what you're referring to, The Time Is Now, and this shows that the distribution network can do more of the heavy lifting now to achieve the targets on time and, importantly, deliver benefits to customers. These benefits delivered by the distribution networks do not mean that any of the large-scale transmission projects are no longer needed or that should be meaningfully delayed. The modelling that was done largely brings forward actions on the distribution grid that have been assumed for the next few decades, which then relieves some timing pressure on the large scale and brings benefits to customers now. So what this report said is that there are benefits to taking these actions on our distribution grid, irrespective of large-scale timing. And one of the largest drivers of consumer benefits comes from accelerating EV adoption. This has real impact on driving down customers' total costs. And we can also get more generation connected to the distribution grid and soak it up with more distribution-connected storage. The key point of this, though, and why we kicked off doing this report, is that these actions are achievable now with the assets and the resources that we have today. And importantly, all customers benefit, regardless of whether those customers have a solar, a battery, an EV. There are levers available to policymakers and regulators under our existing framework that can deliver benefits to all customers.
What do you see as the potential risks in terms of reliability and prices if there's a failure to invest in transmission infrastructure or an underinvestment in that infrastructure?
I think that's possibly a good question for Nexa Advisory, who did a great report on this a number of years ago, looking at the ISP and what the impacts for customers are if ISP projects are delayed, so kind of monetising and costing out what those impacts are. I don't have available to me the exact numbers and so on, but it's quite large numbers for each year or 6 months that the transmission optimal development path is delayed. The costs for customers increase.
But to your question then on why do we need transmission, really, we see this through the lens of coal-fired power stations are closing, and they're closing because they're ageing and they're becoming less reliable, and we are, as a society, committed to net zero, and removing coal from the electricity system is one of the lowest cost ways to get there. And added to this, we're expecting the electricity grid to increase significantly, to more than double. And so this necessarily means building new transmission infrastructure to connect energy from where it's produced in the future to the solar and wind-rich regions into our cities and into our regions.
Thank you. If I could ask now the Australian Energy Council, your submission noted that our energy market governance structure and the responsibility of independent market bodies for different aspects of the system was a best practice model. Are you able to elaborate on that and perhaps also give your views on your confidence in the ISP as reflective of independent expertise and a document that you have confidence in generally?
Sure. So in relation to best practice governance, I'd direct you to the Vertican review. It was a while ago, but it's really quite instructive. And what Vertican found a few different things, but the first was that the 3 different market bodies were set up with different roles and with distinct responsibilities, and there's an element of almost creative tension built into that governance, which kind of represents best practice. There was a period of time after the Finkel review where the Energy Security Board was established to, I guess, drive more of a consensus decision-making approach. The problem with that approach, and I think the high point of the ESB was when they were trying to usher in the NEG, but the problem with the ESB was that it kind of put all of the market bodies on the same level, rather than having the rule maker, the AMC, as the prime market body of the three. And I think a return to those more distinct roles is likely to lead to better outcomes than we've seen. I think there has been a bit of confusion amongst the market bodies about who does what, who has a policy-making role, who operates the market. So I just pause there. In relation to the ISP, I think AEMO is very much doing what it's been told to do in terms of generating that optimal development path consistent with the emissions reductions policies of government. I do note in some of the questioning some frustration or perhaps some confusion about what is the purpose of the ISP, and it can be different things to different people. And I think it's apparent that at times AEMO is essentially doing a modelling exercise of what would need to happen, but it can be received by stakeholders as something that will definitely happen, and that's where some confusion could kick in. So some submissions we've made to AEMO in the ISPs, they could more carefully communicate what the ISP is and what it isn't. And as I was saying to Senator Canavan, the other thing we'd like to see is that kind of baseline scenario of what are we on track to achieving, and to the extent that's something lower than 82% by 2030, what are some decisions that policymakers might be able to make to help bridge that gap?
One of the suggestions that emerged from testimony yesterday was that the removal of legal prohibitions on the nuclear industry in Australia would offer a benefit to the Australian energy system. Can I just ask, from the Australian Energy Council's point of view, is there industry interest in developing and investing in nuclear power in Australia?
Look, from our perspective, we deal, and our members deal, with what's kind of currently on the table. So to the extent the framework is there's a moratorium on nuclear power, I think some of our CEOs have kind of on the record as saying if they're actively exploring, rolling out nuclear power, then they're kind of not focusing on their day job. So if policymakers were to, change that approach at some point in the future, I think they'd be interested in exploring it. I think generally speaking, killing off options and taking off options off the table in an environment where there's uncertainty over the next 10 or 20 years isn't advisable. But our perspective is very much a technology neutral perspective.
And so does that...
One more.
Thanks, Chair. And so do I understand your answer as essentially being one that all options ought to be explored? If you could confirm that and then give me your view or the Australian Energy Council's view on if, for instance, tomorrow prohibitions on nuclear power were removed, would that obviate the need to continue to invest in renewables, storage, transition, or are they, or is it an all of the above approach?
So if it was lifted tomorrow, I don't think it would obviate the need to invest in renewables, both from a timing perspective, and it's also worth making the point that you want a mixture of different generation types. They've got different economic characteristics, different technical characteristics, and this idea that you should just have one or two generation types, I think, introduces more risk into the system than is required.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just going to the ISP, and your submission talks about the draft rule that it might facilitate consideration of distribution networks within the ISP. But at the moment, I'm correct, aren't I, in saying that the ISP really just looks at transmission networks in its planning?
So I think it looks at both, but in different ways. So the ISP treats what happens on the distribution system essentially as an input into its modelling process. So it needs to work out what is the optimal development path or the set of investments that would best deliver government policy objectives over the long term, out to sort of that decarbonisation journey to 2050. But what the output is a plan at the transmission level, and it needs to take into account a whole range of different inputs, including what sort of loads are expected, but also what sort of generation types are sitting within the distribution system. And a lot of detailed modelling and inputs and assumptions work. About a year of the process is working out what are those inputs and how do you frame those up in a way that that stakeholders kind of agree with.
But Tim, you then just, I think, agreed with me that the ISP, its only outputs are transmission projects. It doesn't, for example, while it might take into account the distribution network, it doesn't take a view on how it could be improved and add more economic value to either the NEM or the transition.
We do agree that the ISP needs to continue to evolve, and it should evolve as it has evolved over the last few years.
Yeah. And
so the recent AEMC proposed rule changes on better integrating gas, absolutely, and better integrating consumer energy resources, and through conversations with AEMO on distribution networks, continuing to evolve to better look at distribution networks too. And so to move from it being a static input to a more dynamic input would be a good thing to do.
And we've got our first ISP in 2018. We've now got the 2024, working on the 2026. And we'd be lucky if there's any outputs towards anything other than transmission, the 2026. Given the incredibly good report that ENA put out, the Time Is Now report, where you highlight some of the benefits that could be brought to the energy market that are not, are just network based. A fantastic piece of work, and something I've been calling for a long time. It shows a real vision around what our national electricity market could and should look like. Whereas at the moment, it looks like AEMO looks like a hammer and every problem's a nail, and that nail is transmission. Surely we have to very quickly move beyond this approach and start to look at more unique ways that we can add real economic value to the national electricity market.
We do. One of the things, like I said in my opening statement, is that we do see the time is now actions that can be taken relatively quickly within the policy framework, within the governance framework that needs to happen. And so I have heard, I've heard Daniel Westerman talk about battery storage, about CER. I think there is a strong desire to get more of that in the system. I think there's a difference though between what the ISP is set out to do, what David kind of outlined in his testimony there, as to what it does do and what it doesn't do, and accepting it for that and hoping it evolves. But a lot of these recommendations that are in the Time Is Now can be done through policy change, through the regulatory framework that we've got, to actually get on that in a relatively quick space of time. So we don't see it as, to do the set of recommendations that are here, you need to throw everything out. We think you can work within it and you can get them done.
And I agree. I think those things should be done and should be done now, and probably years ago. But my point is, they make real economic sense moving forward. And the ISP does make an economic benefit case for more transmission. Now, I'm not arguing that more transmission is needed, but if you're planning an energy system, particularly an integrated energy system, as the ISP is called, then you need to be looking beyond just one aspect of that, which is the transmission aspect.
Yeah, I tend to agree. The question for AEMO is probably also one of just modelling and compute capability. It is pretty difficult to have a fully co-optimised distribution set of inputs as well as a fully co-optimised transmission set of outputs as well. So as a task, I think an exercise that could produce that perfect outcome where you know exactly what to do on the transmission system and exactly what to do on the distribution system as an output of that report might be asking a bit too much of it. But the question is, can we better take into account and get a better understanding of what different occurrences on the distribution scale might be able to do and what that means for the optimal development path on the transmission scale. And a lot of that is happening in the rule changes that that Dom mentioned just a moment ago, and that AEMO is being asked to better take into account and integrate the gas and the interactions with the gas system, as well as better take into account the distribution system and the range of possible outcomes that could occur on the distribution system.
Sure, and the report focuses and highlights bring in more EVs. Lots of things that are adding real value and economic value. And I would assume, although it's not been modelled by anyone, particularly AEMO, what other projects does that displace? By having more rooftop solar, do you displace the need for line augmentation somewhere, or with batteries, either co-located with generation or at either end of the transmission or distribution lines? How do you strengthen the system? And the ISP takes, it has one single counterfactual, that's all or nothing transmission. It doesn't even differentiate between connecting reses, for example, and interstate interconnectors. There's, to Mr. Feeney's point, there's probably a number of baselines that it wouldn't be difficult for AEMO to model, other than one they do, and that seems simply because they want one particular outcome.
We can probably only comment to the extent that this was tested within the modelling that underpinned our Time Is Now report.
Yeah.
And what that did was to take the inputs for the ISP and add more solar and more batteries within the distribution system. And what the outcome at the transmission system was, though, that you still see a need for those transmission projects. The renewable energy zones are still getting filled up. So it may take a tiny bit of timing pressure off some of those investments, but not really on the modelling. You still need those to come through at pace.
Thank you, and I have lots more questions on that. I'd love to put, and I might put them on notice. I just want to touch. Your members are also gas distribution networks. With the move to electrification and moving away from gas, how does your industry and you as peak body, how are we going to view, or what thoughts do you have on how we make that a just transition if we have to make it?
Yeah, so when we say gas, I think it's important to put gas into context. 70% of gas is for industry, heavy manufacturing, 10% of gas is in the home. And so where customers on any side of that spectrum can electrify, they should electrify.
Yep.
But there is also an incredible role that gas currently plays in Australia and will continue to play, and I think that's becoming increasingly clear, that does underpin the economy and that we need a decarbonisation pathway for that. The recent future gas strategy went some way to address that, but there are more that needs to be done to make sure that heavy industry, in particular high heat feedstock, has a decarbonisation pathway. And we put out a report, Renewable Gas Pathway for Australia, that sets out a kind of optimised way of getting there. But it's going to need renewable gas, and it's going to need policy that underpins to make that happen. Otherwise, we're going to see those jobs go offshore, and we're going to see manufacturing go offshore.
100% agree. I'm more asking, is the industry working with government? Because obviously, once the gas distribution networks are stranded, or you hit a point where there's, customers are paying more and more because there's less customers on the network and the charges stay the same. It sounds like a bit of an economic black hole that's coming towards us. I'm just concerned whether that's being managed properly.
So when it comes to gas distribution, it is important to notice that isn't just gas in the home. A lot of industry is still connected to gas distribution networks. Now, that said, there are high levels of uncertainty around the pathway and the pace of the overall energy transition, and the potential for the economic life of the overall network to be shorter than previously considered. And so networks are proposing adjustments to depreciation and following engagement with customer representatives and a consideration of a range of scenarios. So this is not the entire solution to this uncertainty, but adjusting for depreciation provides one way to recognise potential asset stranding risk, and it also supports intergenerational equity, to your point, by allowing more recovery of the network asset capital base where there are more customers on that network.
No view that if it's a government-driven decision that it should be put on or transferred to the government balance sheet rather than to energy users?
There are no easy answers to this question, and I think the continuing engagement between the regulator and the different market bodies and customers and the industry is something that will need to continue over the next few years.
But this is largely just a Victorian problem, isn't it? So
not necessarily.
No? But Victoria has the largest gas distribution network, and it's only the Victorian government, as far as I'm aware, that's pushing to turn off gas to Victorian homes.
So Victoria has 70% of the domestic gas demand into homes, so it absolutely is topical there. And we're continuing to work with that Victorian government on this issue.
Terrific. I look forward to hearing more about that moving forward. Thank you for appearing today. Where am I? And thank you for your evidence. The committee has set Wednesday, 13 November, as the due date for questions taken on notice. I'm not sure that there were any, but you will most likely receive some written ones from me.
We have got one from Senator Canavan. We've got that one. Thank
you. Terrific.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for appearing. And next is Nexa Advisory, please.
That's great.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for appearing at the Energy Planning and Regulation Australia. I think I welcome Ms. Stephanie Bashir, Chief Executive Officer of Nexa Advisory. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate inquiries has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Yes. Good afternoon. It's Stephanie Bashir, CEO of Nexa Advisory.
Thank you. Ms. Bashir, would you like to make a short opening statement?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So Nexa Advisory welcomes the opportunity to appear before the Select Committee on the Energy Planning and Regulation in Australia to discuss this important issue. Nexa is a for-purpose advisory firm. Our unwavering focus is accelerating the clean energy transition in a way that provides secure, reliable and affordable power for consumers of all types. As technical as it might seem, there is a straight line from the issues of planning and regulation to the electricity bills that Australian families and businesses pay. Debate about how to deliver best practice governance of the energy market has been ongoing for many years, including several reviews initiated by the former Council of Australian Governments, COAG Energy Council. There is a broad agreement that Australia's energy market governance is not fit for purpose. That means Australians are bearing unnecessary cost of delays to the energy transition. The reviews have consistently highlighted issues which have not been adequately addressed. These include the need for energy ministers to have a clear role in providing policy and strategic direction, the lack of clarity about the role of market bodies and the potential for that to lead to conflicts of interest, and the poor engagement with stakeholders and lack of transparency. Nexa Advisory's submission to the committee sets out the issues in detail and offers 6 detailed recommendations. I would summarise those here into 3 key asks. Australia needs a strategic energy plan with bipartisan support. It must set the roles and priorities for the market bodies and regulators, including their governance and engagement. The federal government must commission an independent review of the boards of the AER, the AEMC, AEMO, Energy Consumers Australia, to ensure alignment with the strategy, clarity of roles, and to ensure that they have the right mix of skills and knowledge and are appropriately independent. The federal government must also commission an independent review of the electricity networks. In particular, it's important that the review assess whether ring-fencing rules, which are in place to protect Australian taxpayers and energy consumers, are being appropriately applied in spirit and in law. Current market structures and governance arrangements are not keeping pace with developments across the world in new energy, new business models, changing consumer preferences and decarbonisation. And if this is not addressed, we will have little success in managing the risks and embracing the opportunities of a more dynamic power system, let alone meeting our climate targets. There is a clear need to provide greater strategic leadership, policy coherence and coordination for the energy sector. This would increase customer engagement and social licence and, most importantly, investment certainty. That would support the development of critical transmission infrastructure, the build-out of renewable energy to replace our fleet of ageing, unreliable and expensive coal power generators. It would get the clean energy transition done, and it would provide secure, reliable and affordable energy for all consumers who are also taxpayers and voters, and meet our commitments to international agreements on emissions. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Senator Canavan.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much. Just want to ask, trying to get to the bottom of this, and you might not be able to help, but just particularly with these consumer, is it CEO, is it Consumer Energy Resources?
Consumer Energy Resources is what's being, the term used in the energy industry, yes.
I get confused with all the acronyms in this space. How are they dealt with at the moment, the ISP? I think we sort of learned from last week and yesterday that it would appear that AEMO don't cost the acquisition of, say, batteries, I don't know about rooftop solar, that sort of stuff in their modelling. Do you know how that works in the ISP?
So I guess the ISP, obviously, I'll leave that question for AEMO to answer in detail, but from my perspective, the ISP currently provides a forward forecast on what are the types of investments that basically are required to close down the coal power stations based on the dates that they are provided from the coal owners. Obviously, there are a couple of scenarios. The step change scenario, which has been, if you like, chosen as the pathway. Obviously, the step change is not a 1.5 degree scenario, it's a 1.8 scenario, and that really is a very conservative scenario to look at what sort of investments are needed in their terms at lowest cost to deliver the transition and drive the investment needed in order to have the right replacement generation ahead of the coal closures.
Just to be clear, I know this is a really complex area, so I'm not trying to be cute, but to be clear, what AEMO said last week is that the coal closures in their model is driven by the carbon budgets primarily, not the closure dates. Their closure dates in their ISP are often sooner than what has been publicly announced. On FOI, the Freedom of Information Request, AEMO revealed that their battery forecasts in the ISP require a 50% CapEx subsidy from this year. Now, I don't believe, you might be able to correct me, but I don't believe we have such a policy in place in Australia. But what do you think is needed? Do you think we need to get these forecasts to be paying for half the costs of the installation of a battery at people's homes?
Yeah, so at the moment, the ISP is forecasting that we need 22 gigawatts of energy storage, so it's not just batteries, right, but more broadly, by 2030, and roughly 49 by 2050. We currently have 3 gigawatts in the system connected. Of course, there's a lot of projects in the pipeline, but to get from 3 gigawatts to the assumed forecast of 22 gigawatts, that's a huge investment that's going to be required. This is where basically the capacity investment scheme that was announced by the federal government plays a really significant role, especially dedicated auctions that would support energy storage projects. And at the same time, the New South Wales long-term service agreements with the Altessa scheme, which was designed really to encourage and incentivise energy storage projects. In my view, these things are not happening fast enough still, even with the auctions that are available. We did some research earlier in the year in partnership with the Clean Energy Investor Group on the financeability of energy storage in Australia, where we outlined some of the key issues around energy storage and what are some of the key policies required to really expedite investment in energy storage.
Okay, I'm still just come back to this issue of should we subsidise it. I suppose I'm a bit mindful that we learnt last week that we're now introducing what I've called a sun tax. So from next year in Sydney, if you're an Ausgrid, you have to pay. Yeah. You'll have to pay to export your solar power to the grid, and seemingly this is a result of the over-subsidisation of solar energy, and we now have too much of it, and we've got to tax it, even though apparently the sun was free. So I just wonder, I mean, if we go down this path of sort of getting people to install batteries as much as they can, possibly AEMO seems to suggest subsidising it to a significant degree, well, aren't we just creating more problems when we try and we push here in the energy network and tilt it towards this technology? Then we have these other problems down the track like we have now by having to introduce a sun tax. How do we avoid that? Energy
storage is actually quite a big solution to a lot of the problems that we've currently got. You hear, you know, there's minimum demand issues on the network because of the increased uptake of solar. Batteries actually can resolve that, especially home batteries. You hear that, you know, there's electricity prices and people are really struggling paying their bills. Solar and batteries solves that directly. And all the system issues that we hear from the market operator around, you know, the variable renewables and the uptake of solar, and consistently, energy storage really is a firming technology that, if expedited, can resolve a lot of the issues that we've got right now. And so, as we are phasing out our current coal power stations that have served us well for decades, we actually need to do very similar investments as a country in the replacement technologies. And right now, energy storage is a really big benefit for us.
So, I'm not disputing any of that. I suppose the issue is at what cost. And at least as far as I've heard so far in this inquiry, we're not really getting a good measure of the cost of installing consumer energy resources through the ISP, or nothing else that I've seen. So no doubt that possibly installing batteries might help this issue of excess solar, might reduce peaks in the evening, etc. But someone should be still doing I think, the running the rule over this and deciding, well, is this worth it? And so do you know of anyone who's done that, or do you have any, you're obviously an advocate for this option, where's the cost-benefit analysis showing this is worth it?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of different cost-benefit analysis over the years, and it's important to separate consumer energy resources and batteries in the home versus utility-scale batteries, and that topic really does need to be separated. Consumer energy resources, people are investing in that, even with some subsidies with solar and that, Australians are investing in those technologies to put them in their home so that they can reduce their bills. On the utility scale side, one of the key issues, I guess, which is why it requires still the right incentives and governments to have the right policies, is there is a lack of certainty on when the coal power stations will close to allow for investors to understand when the revenue streams for these investments can actually take place. That has a lot of impact on the financeability and financial closures of these projects.
How much does a battery cost at a household level?
Up to $15,000.
$15,000?
Yeah. That's a rough estimate.
Right.
There's a lot cheaper batteries as well.
I'm just wondering, how do you get a payback on that then? I mean, let's just run some rough cost benefit now. I've just brought up the average bill in Ausgrid, the network I was mentioning. The average residential bill is around $1,800 a year at the moment. $15,000. I mean, I presume, unless the battery can get your bill down to zero, which is probably unlikely, and obviously you need to install solar and other things to power the battery, that's not going to be paid back in even 7 years. So how is it, I'm just coming back to this point, how is that maths, like, it seems like even AEMO need to force a 50% subsidy to get that down to 7,500 to get people to take it up. I'm just looking for the quantitative data here for why this is a good idea.
Even without really direct subsidies here in Australia, Australians are still buying behind-the-meter batteries. We've had over 400,000 batteries installed over the last decade, and there's just in this year alone 147,000 batteries have been installed. I guess you can look at just the cost, pure cost, but you can also look at it from a broader perspective. What are some of the things that we can do to help actually incentivize these batteries? For example, tariff reform. We've talked about network tariff reform for decades. We still don't have the right tariffs that incentivize these types of purchases. And just like, we had solar, a decade ago, solar technology was very expensive, but with the right incentives, the tariffs, and the demand for that, and the competition, Australia leads the way in rooftop solar, and we really should be looking at how can we actually replicate a similar model for behind-the-meter batteries.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Gosh.
Thank you. May we stay on that topic, because I was interested in your submission that opportunities to manage some of the issues by incentivising consumer behaviour have been neglected. I notice you've been talking about some of those incentives with Senator Canavan. Are there any others that you'd like to mention or elaborate on in terms of encouraging desirable consumer behaviour?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We actually did quite a number of analysis into the consumer energy or distributed energy resources, and we found that there are some really low-hanging fruit that can actually, if taken action into now, we can accelerate the take-up and mitigate a lot of the issues that get talked about in the industry. For example, we hear a lot that rooftop solar is causing minimum demand issues on the system, right? However, we are also hearing that the networks are the distribution electricity networks are underutilised, and we've seen that from the Energy Networks Australia report and also some of the reports that have been released by the AER. The key thing around consumer energy is it reduces bills directly. So what do we actually need to do? It does solve the problem of a lot of the issues that people are talking about, especially when we're talking about coupled with a battery or a battery on wheels, which are the electric vehicles. The uptake of electric vehicles does solve the minimum demand issue with charging at the right times. But right now, from a low-hanging fruit perspective, there's no visibility at the low voltage level on the network in a public kind of reporting way where these capacity issues are, and if the network was to augment these capacity issues, how much it would cost. Those signals are a very important signal to be able to attract non-network solutions, whether they're bigger batteries on the network or behind-the-meter batteries that would present a business case for providers and aggregators to deliver these types of options and solutions. So publicly available data on network capacity and constraints with the cost is really, really important. The other low-hanging fruit, as I mentioned, is tariffs. We keep talking about tariffs, but we are yet to see a proper review on how do we actually get tariffs that are up to date and consistent with where we are as an industry in the energy transition that we're in. We continue to introduce mechanisms and tariffs that penalise consumers who are trying to do the right thing, like the export tariff that Senator Canavan mentioned. But we also see that AEMO, working with the states, they've introduced the backstop mechanism, and they're saying that will only be used in an emergency state. But we haven't really seen yet what is going to be the steps ahead of that before it gets to an emergency. There are solutions that can be applied, and I think energy storage does play a big part in that.
One of the other aspects of your submission was related to Energy Consumers Australia, and you observed that they'd focused on advocacy for traditional energy customers, including vulnerable hardship customers and lower socioeconomic customers, and I think that's very understandable, but perhaps there was less focus on new energy consumers. In terms of resolving that issue, is that a function of having a separate advocacy body, or is that simply a function of having Energy Consumers Australia widen its remit?
It is a gap at the moment, and it's been a gap for many years. It's the new energy consumer, which is more and more a key part of the energy market, and they are driving the transition. I think, either reviewing the board of the ECA and its remit, or having a separate energy consumer focus. But where our submission really is calling for is a review of all the market bodies and regulators, including the ECA, a review of their boards to ensure that consumer voice and investor voice is represented, because where we are and where we're moving to is definitely where we have been, and it's definitely not fit for purpose.
In fact, one of the earlier witnesses referred to your work in this space. I'm not sure if you heard that, but can I ask you about some of the work you've done on the importance of transmission investment? Are you able to elaborate on why investment in transmission is so important in our energy context?
Absolutely. I guess we have done quite a lot of analysis over the years, focusing on that question of, what is holding up the renewable investment or the replacement generation coming online to replace the coal power stations in a timely, orderly way. And the key answer keeps coming up as transmission. Transmission right now is holding up the investment in renewables and whether that's the existing grid and lack of capacity on the existing grid, or transmission that is needed in new areas where renewable projects can actually generate the wind and the solar that's needed. And we have done as well analysis on if we continue to delay the build out of transmission, because we've been talking about it for a very long time. And if I point to the committee, before the ISP, AEMO used to produce what was called the National Transmission Network Development Plan. And in those plans, AEMO basically had many of the transmission lines that are currently in the ISP. Things like the Western Renewables Link, VNI West, Project Energy Connect. These were all projects that were identified as needed in the system even before the ISP came about. We still have them in the planning, but we're not building them, or we're not building them fast enough. And one of the key issues is not only is our regulatory framework not fit for purpose, so the regulatory investment test that assesses the investment in transmission, the Power Energy Connect transmission project, which is quite significant to connect South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, took over 10 years for that transmission project to get approved through the pipeline and ongoing loops of the regulatory system. But more importantly, there's just no accountability on delivery. So you identify a project, but there is no one accountable to deliver these projects on time, and the dates just keep moving.
And what do you see the consequences in terms of price for consumers as the delay of the delayed investment in transmission?
It's higher electricity prices, and we've done modelling. We engaged with Endgame Economics to help do the modelling on the implications of the delays of transmission build-out and the continuous push of these timelines, and the delays and implications are quite significant. I'll give you an example, and this is not just on the wholesale prices. On the wholesale prices, it is quite significant, especially in New South Wales and Victoria. But in New South Wales, for example, a 3-year delay in building transmission results in $1,092 increase on consumer bills, and these are households. Businesses are impacted a lot more, and right now there is a minimum focus on business customers and the implication of delays to our businesses, whether they're small or large here in Australia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ms Bashir, you talk about one of the things you refer to is lack of accountability in our market bodies for delays in planning, approvals, delivery, and they're all having an effect on our system, correct?
I would just slightly correct that, if I may. The accountability on actually delivering things on time, and it's not necessarily the market bodies per se, it is more accountable. There is no one right now accountable to deliver infrastructure in energy on time, and the transmission networks who are appointed to deliver these projects in the regulatory framework, they have no accountability for delivery on time.
Thank you. And this inquiry was set up to look at accountability right throughout our system. And with that lack of accountability, we're seeing delays, as you mentioned. We also see price increases as transmission projects get more and more expensive just due to, well, the stated reason is inflation over time, even though those timeframes are very, very short. So given all those things, and we're still relying just on transmission to help with the transition, is there not cause, or would you believe that there are reasons to look at the way we plan the system in a more holistic way?
Yeah. So I don't think we need either or. We absolutely need to build the big stuff. And we need to invest in new transmission lines because we do need the replacement generation to be built and connected in a timely way, or we all pay for it. Mm-hmm. However, there are some medium and short-term solutions that can help accelerate and minimize the implications while we are building the big infrastructure. And I go back to my point earlier on energy storage. Utility-scale storage is one of these solutions that can help reduce, alleviate some of the capacity issues on the existing transmission, to minimize curtailment of projects. We can also use energy storage.
Come back to that because I've got some specific questions about storage as well. You talk about all of this is leading to, well, there's uncertainty about the closure of coal. Are all these delays due to the current processes we're using now? Are they contributing to, in your mind, are they contributing to keeping coal in the system longer?
Yes, we're not building things fast enough. Absolutely. And so our solution is always to extend the date.
Yes.
Rather than think about, okay, well, we know whether it's, using the carbon budget as the timeline or the timeline that actually the owners of the coal power stations publish and report to AEMO. Either of these, we should be planning ahead of time and ensuring that we are shoring up investment in the replacement generation coupled with the firming required to make sure that these dates are not extended and taxpayers are not paying unnecessary subsidies to keep those coal power stations open.
Thank you. I agree. So the fastest way to get rid of coal is more renewable generation, probably in the reses, and the documents behind the ISP point to a lot of proposed generation or generation that's proposed to be built. So we then need transmission to get that into load centres, like from the rhombus of regret into Melbourne, get that energy into the system. But then, to your point, we also need storage or other non-network solutions, because the problem's not just network, is it?
No.
A large part of the problem that we're facing at the moment, and this is on the consumer side as well as on the large-scale side, is that given the enormous amount of generation that's happening in the middle of the day, we're seeing negative prices and lots of other distortions in the marketplace that just transmission alone won't solve. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So a better way to plan the system would be to look at all the solutions that might solve for the problem we've got, which is largely time of day, and being able to move load around, to be able to arbitrage that energy, to be able to provide FCAS services. Batteries have a real, well, not just an economic benefit. There are revenue. There's revenues that can be derived from batteries, isn't there?
That's correct. Yeah.
So batteries derive revenue and provide system services and benefits to the grid as a whole, that they can recover their own costs on a not on a cost recovery basis, on a revenue basis. Right. So with batteries, you don't, it's a better way to grow the network or hasten the transition. Becomes better and faster and more economical if you're not just relying on on a piece of infrastructure that relies on getting a guaranteed return from energy users. Is there, am I making or is there an economic argument there that should be made for a broader sense of how we plan the system?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in terms of, if we go back to the ISP, it does forecast quite significant amount of storage needed to come in. It's then what are some of the mechanisms and tools to make sure we remove the barriers that exist for these projects to come online faster. We incentivize the right market, provide the right market signals and incentives, essential services, inertia, system strength, all of these things that really should be in place to value energy storage and the services they provide, just like other technologies in the system. I think these are the things that should be prioritised by the market bodies. There should be a direct focus on looking at what are some of the low-hanging fruit things that we need to create now that bring and shore up energy storage and services and value from energy storage into the system rather than focusing on other things.
100% agree, and thank you for that evidence. The transition away in the decarbonisation of the grid is really going to depend on this, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And it's nearly 2025. All this transmission that AEMO's planned for is still years off being built. Is Project Energy Connect even finished yet?
No, it's not. It's been delayed again. And, you know, we've got VNI West that's due to come online, but that's not shovel ready. We've got the Western Renewables Link that's stuck